Okay, welcome to the lecture for Psych 350. We'll be talking about research relevant to the trait approach. I'd say it's impossible to summarize all of the key findings relevant to trait approach in one lecture. Probably difficult to do in a single semester. The ideas first advanced by trait theorists have become such an integral part of psychological research that it's hard to find a study, just looking around in research in general, that doesn't include some measurement of a trait. Right? So when we're looking at individuals, predominantly the research is using the trait approach. So here we'll just focus on a few of the more interesting areas of trait research that have been developed. Okay, the first area we'll talk about is achievement motivation. Now, the early work in this area was primarily based on Murray's ideas about individual differences in need for achievement. And he talked about the desire to accomplish something difficult, to master, manipulate, or organize, to overcome obstacles and attain a high standard, to excel oneself. Right? So this is striving to achieve, to do things beyond just the average. Right? And the idea that people differed in the degree to which they had that desire or need to strive. In terms of measurement, there's two fairly common ways of measuring achievement motivation. The one being the TAT, or thematic apperception test, and the other being some other self-report measure. So the TAT, is one of those projective tests where you're not asking them directly, how much do you want to achieve? How important is it to you for stuff to happen? Right. That's where you're showing them pictures, and then one of the things they should be doing is projecting their need for achievement into the stories. Now, the results of these things sometimes come into conflict. So you may get, working with an individual, you may see them being very high in need for achievement or achievement motivation using the TAT, but then give them a self-report measure and they're not so high. So why is that? Well, it could be that the TAT measures an implicit need for achievement, one that we're not really aware of, whereas self-report measures the conscious aspect of this need. So there may be some people for whom these things are concordant, where you really want to achieve and you know it. Other people, maybe because of family background, culturally, it may not be okay with themselves to acknowledge that they do want to achieve a great deal, or vice versa. They really don't give much about achieving. They don't care, but they feel like they should care. They're in a position that, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be this high-powered person who wants to do all these things. Right? So now, in more recent research, we talk about motivation for achievement more so than need for achievement, right? Because need seems to imply some biological imperative, where I have to achieve. And it's not clear if this is the case, or if it is simply more a matter of wanting or preferring to achieve. Right? So talking about motivation for achievement covers kind of both of these possibilities. In terms of how do people differ? So what's a high score, or like somebody high in achievement motivation? Well, they tend to be moderate risk takers, right? So they want success, but they also don't want failure. So they're not going to overreach, because it's so important to succeed that you can't go too far. Because when you go too far, you try too hard, take too big a chance, you're increasing the odds of failure. They also tend to be energetic workers, but their energy and enthusiasm is typically reserved for tasks that are likely to contribute to achievement. So they're not going to just work hard at everything. They're going to selectively direct their energy to work hard toward things that they think are going to pay off, right? Or they give them an opportunity to show what they can do. They also tend to be accountable, right? They want to get credit for their work, and they're willing to take responsibility for failure as well as success. And lastly, they tend to be successful in business, certainly, up to a point. It's interesting that low-level managers tend to be higher in need for achievement than your CEOs, your high-level executives. CEOs, however, tend to be higher in need for power. And there also may be some differences there in risk-taking, right? Where people who, it's so important to succeed, if they don't take that risk, well, sometimes that risk is what gets you to that next level up. Okay. In terms of development, how do people come to have a high or low level of achievement motivation? Well, given that it seems to be a generally desirable trait, right? You don't think, oh, I wish my son or daughter was a slacker. Nobody says that. You might ask, how does one become high in need for achievement? Well, parents who find that balance between giving attention and support without suffocating or hovering tend to produce kids who go on to be higher in need for achievement or achievement motivation. So it's that giving them, you don't just throw them to the wolves, right? But you also don't do everything for them. It's that kind of happy medium that tends to work out, which seems to be true for a lot of things. Beyond parents, there are certainly other influences on achievement motivation, on achieving. Right? I know that gender and culture certainly play a large role. A lot of the early research was restricted to men, and men in Western civilizations. And success in the business world related to need for achievement has been found in women too, but there may be some subtle differences in how men and women define achievement. Right? There are pronounced differences in how achievement is defined by individualistic cultures compared to collectivist cultures. In some ways, what we know about the correlations of need for achievement or achievement motivation may not apply to all members of collectivist cultures. Right? So I'm going to achieve, I'm going to get that promotion, get that job, whereas in a collectivist culture, that may be not what you think is the thing to do. It may be, oh, I really want our team to, beat this benchmark, to do this other thing, right? Which we don't typically think of measuring as Westerners from our individualistic perspective. It's also important to think about attributions in terms of researchers have looked at what explanations or attributions people make after success or failure, and how these thoughts, how these attributions influence how a person feels and what they will do with regard to trying again to achieve or giving up. And they've identified 3 aspects of attribution that seem to really matter and make a difference: stability, locus, and control. If you want to increase someone's motivation to achieve, to try to get them to make unstable attributions for failures and stable, internal, controllable attributions for success. Right? So when things go wrong, you want them to say, oh yeah, well it was unstable. The reason was unstable. It's not something that's always going to happen. Whereas whenever they succeed, you want to think, okay, it happened this way, and there's a stable reason for it. It's always going to happen this way, and it happened. There's an internal reason. It happened because of what I did. Right? It's not the fates. It's not the gods are always good to me. Right? It's I did something. I'm always going to do that thing. And then lastly, it's controllable, and I can do it again. Right? So when you succeed, if you can kind of think about your success being due to what you did, that you can do it again and you can control it, you're more likely to keep trying and also to succeed again. If you make those uncontrollable external attributions, probably going to give up because what are you going to do? That's kind of the idea, right? Last thing I want to talk about on this, goals. Researchers also address differences in goals with regard to achievement. Mastery goals versus performance goals, and approach goals versus avoidance goals. More achievement beyond some set goal typically occurs for people that have mastery goals than performance goals. Right? So whenever you aren't saying, I really want to just, my goal is to, have bake this cake that is going to be exactly like this other cake that some celebrity chef made. Okay, great. If your idea is, if your goal is, I want to be able to bake the best cake possible, and I want to become a master at it. I want to do everything well. So not just I have some kind of criterion. Okay, I want to do this one thing. But if it's more kind of broad and entails mastery, that tends to be associated with better achievement, and also better achievement is associated with approach goals than avoidance goals. So if you say, I really want to pass this class, then you're more likely to do well and achieve more than if you say, I really don't want to fail this class, right? I don't want to fail is an avoidance goal. I want to avoid some negative consequence. Going through life that way typically doesn't work out well for people, right? It's always striving to something, not trying to avoid something or running away from something that tends to be associated with more positive outcomes, especially when it comes to achievement. Okay, let's talk about trait research and health. Right. So we talk about the Type A personality, Type A, Type B, and its relationship to hostility and health. So something we call coronary prone behavior pattern, right, which is kind of trying to replace that Type A, Type B nomenclature. In CPBP is something where medical professionals have noticed a pattern, looking kind of retrospectively, that people who had heart attacks seem to differ with regard to personality traits from people who didn't have heart attacks, right? Despite having some other risk factors in common, right? So, oh yeah, this group and that group, they were both smokers, they were both drinkers, neither one exercised. But these guys who smoked and drank and didn't exercise didn't have a heart attack. But these other ones did. How are they different? Well, they seem to be different on this personality trait, right? And this pattern came to be known as, Type A personality, commonly referred to as. But even though they use that here, don't be lulled into thinking, oh, well, yeah, it's trait research is about types of people, this type or that type. No, that's just kind of a shorthand for them to say, okay, people that have this pattern on this one trait. Again, trait theorists don't really believe in types or categories of people. Think instead of this as being something that's a dimension. People can be high or low in level of Type A-ness, rather than you are Type A, you aren't Type A. Right? So what is this Type A dimension, this trait? Well, in some ways it's very similar to people high in need for achievement, high in achievement motivation. There tend to be three components. They tend to be high in competitive achievement striving. Right? They want to win or succeed regardless of the stakes. So going for big promotion, playing tiddlywinks, gonna win. Doesn't matter what it's for. Really important to compete. Second, they tend to have a sense of time urgency. Folks that say, hey, let's get it done, let's get it done now. People, we don't have time to wait. And third, and one that may be the most important in terms of health, they tend to experience anger in response to frustration. Whereas people lower on this continuum, who might be referred to as Type B, are more easygoing and less interested in competition, and they're just kind of harder to piss off. Excuse me. So, why should we care about this? What's important about this? Well, there are some interesting correlations between level of Type A-ness, level of coronary prone behavior pattern, and other things. People that are higher in kind of this Type A trait tend to exhibit a stronger desire to be in control of situations and other people. So if you're working in a group situation, it's good to know if you're working with a Type A type person, somebody who's high in Type A, because they're going to really be uncomfortable and frustrated and then angry if they can't have some control, at least think they can have some control. People higher in this Type A trait tend to achieve more on tests, academically, in sports. But where might these folks not achieve more? Right? Because they don't achieve more everywhere, because in some fields that striving and competing works against you, right? So if you're maybe in even in sports, if there's a sport that really relies on truly team play, being Type A, never passing the ball, Allen Iverson, I'm looking at you, may not work out for you in terms of reaching bigger goals. And beyond that, being kind of high in Type A tends to be associated with heart disease, right? And that was really some early studies that, oh, look out, Type A people, they're all going to have heart attacks. But again, in behavioral science, it's all about replication. If you find something once, it's not established fact. It's, oh, that's interesting. I wonder how true that is. Right? It was true with this one group of people this one time. Show us again. And some other studies failed to replicate this relationship between type A personality and heart disease. And people are like, well, what's going on? I thought type A was definitely, you have the heart disease. These people, you have some type A people that not so much. And it turns out that, going back to what we talked about earlier, that there's at least those three components, that being type A is not just this kind of unidimensional trait. It's not one thing. Oh, are you high in type A, are you not? Right? There are these different dimensions that contribute to it. And it's only one component of being type A that seems to be related to heart disease. Right? And those components tend to be correlated. So if you're high in one component, you tend to be high in all three, but not necessarily. Somebody could be high in two, but not one. And the one that's really important for heart disease is that hostility. Right? So if you're high in hostility, that's what's associated with heart disease. So getting angry at frustrating events and even small things, that's what's going to kill you. The good news, for those of you who are, oh man, I'm going to die. I'm definitely hostile. I got that dimension of type A. There's some good news. Right? This personality trait is amenable to change. People can be taught, they can learn new ways of dealing with frustration that does not lead to such high levels of emotional upset. Right? And this change in emotional experience is then correlated with decreased risk of heart disease. So if you are one of those people that tends to get really angry when frustrated, think about talking to somebody about that. You know, read a book about it. See a counselor, because you'll live longer. Okay. Social anxiety, another area where trait research has contributed quite a bit. So conceptualizing this as a personality trait. Most people experience some level of anxiety, of increased physiological arousal, right? Heart rate, sweaty palms, a little bit of that. So everybody gets a little bit when in social situations, as compared to when they're alone. It tends to be, there's some arousal, right? But people differ in the degree of their arousal, so how much your heart rate goes up and all that stuff. But they also differ in how that arousal is interpreted, right? Some people may interpret it as a signal of distress, right, about possible danger or discomfort, like, oh, my heart's beating, this is bad, this could be danger. Other people interpret it as a signal of excitement and good things to come. Like, oh yeah, all these people, my heart's really beating, I'm jacked, this is going to be awesome. Right? So people differ in that level of physiological arousal, and then they also differ in this kind of cognitive component of how they interpret that arousal. And those two things contribute to whether or not they're likely to experience what we talk about being social anxiety. And this is different from introversion, at least the way trait theorists talk about introversion. Right? Introversion is not synonymous with shyness, even though it tends to be used that way quite often. The idea behind introversion for trait theorists is that they gain pleasure or satisfaction from spending time alone, in their own minds. People that are really enjoy being in their heads and thinking about stuff. Rather than being in crowds. It's about this preference. And they may or may not be anxious when they're around other people. And you have a lot of people that are socially anxious, that you may think of as being shy, but they would like to be around people. They don't enjoy being alone, don't enjoy being in their heads. They would rather be at that party. It's just really uncomfortable for them to do so. So there's a distinction there between the social anxiety idea and this introversion-extroversion idea. So in terms of some of the research regarding the initiation of social interactions, people high in social anxiety expect social interactions to go poorly, right? So there's that cognitive component of expectation. And they expect other people to negatively evaluate them. Oh, they're going to think I'm ugly. They're going to think I'm an idiot. They're going to think I'm awkward, whatever it is. And whenever you think that way, it affects your behavior, right? So they're then timid when interacting with others. Right? They tend to cut conversations short. They tend to be more reluctant to start talking. They're not going to talk first. And all of those things that they do that follow their thoughts. I'm worried about this, if I'm going to do these things. And then all those things that they do are picked up on their sense by the other person. And the other person may then negatively evaluate them and go, geez, this person's really awkward. They're not talking to me. They're fidgeting with their hands. They're doing all this stuff. Man, they're kind of weird, right? So this ends up being this self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's one of the important things for kind of treatment or remediation if you want it to be different. Again, can be up to a point, and a lot of it has to do with changing your expectations. Right? If you don't expect people to think of you negatively, and you don't expect it to go poorly, but instead, again, this goes back to going toward the positive instead of away from the negative. If you expect interaction to go well, you expect people to think highly of you, you'll act more natural and calm and normal, and then people will treat you that way. But in terms of when this becomes pathological, it may be labeled social phobia. Right, looking at the DSM, and this involves a fear of negative evaluation in social or performance settings. And this isn't the same thing as shyness, but tends to be related. Social phobia can be restricted to just one setting. So it could be, oh, it's just public speaking. I'm fine at parties, but dealing with people freaks me out. Or it could be, sometimes this happens to baseball players. Catchers throwing the ball back to the pitcher. They do it wrong once, and then they develop this anxiety about throwing the ball back. Right, they get the yips, and so they end up having to walk the ball back to the pitcher, or they're afraid they're going to overthrow it. If that happens and it becomes, it significantly interferes with their academic, occupational, or social functioning, it may kind of warrant this label of social phobia. But some people have social phobia generalized type, and that's where it's not just one situation, but it's most situations. And those are folks that tend to be more like somebody who's just very, very shy, where they're just always expecting people to judge them negatively. And they experience a lot of anxiety when they're around people who could possibly evaluate them. Okay, so now a little bit about trait research and what it has to say about our experience of emotions. Affectivity is one thing that trait researchers are interested in. And affectivity is the extent to which we typically experience positive and negative emotions. You might say, well, what are you talking about? Are you talking about positive emotions, negative emotions, or both? Well, that's kind of a question. And we're not sure if it is a single trait, right? Where, people feel a lot, and they differ on simply what they feel. People feel, I'm typically experience a lot of happy emotions. I'm a person who typically experiences a lot of negative emotions. Or are there these two traits where people, so the level of positive emotions you experience is one trait, and the level of a negative emotional experiences you have being associated with a separate trait, where you could be high in both, low in both, high in one, low in the other. Right? You have all these different possible combinations if they're not on the same dimension. Right? And we know that you can have positive and negative emotions at the same time. Right? Emotional experiences are incredibly complex, more so than many of our other kind of psychological experiences. So this idea of, is it two traits, is it one, still being researched, jury's still out. But there already has been some research just looking generally on level of how often and how much do you experience emotions, and that being affectivity. And in terms of correlates of affectivity, research has indicated that people high in affectivity tend also to be very sociable. So affectivity is associated with sociability. And this is why behavioral therapists often prescribe that, fake it till you make it for depression. And so even if you're not being happy, go out and be around people. It's not just that being around people will make you happy, because again, depression isn't just about being sad. Depression, especially chronic depression, often becomes about the absence of emotions. People that are depressed for a long time, many report not feeling sad, they report not feeling anything. We become affectively flat. So going out and being around people, even if they piss you off, that's a feeling, that's something, which often is different than the depression. It can sometimes break them out of that rut of depression, with obviously positive emotions being probably better for you than the negative ones, but any emotion at all sometimes is better than none. Also, people high in affectivity also tend to have more health complaints and more health problems, possibly because of the effect of experiencing emotions on the body, right? And then vice versa, the body's health experience, going back the other way, affecting your experience of emotions. Or it could be because emotions affect health-related behavior. We don't know. That's kind of an area of growing research. In terms of intensity of experienced emotions, typically, this being the idea that what's your typical strength of the emotions you experience is the intensity we're talking about. Some people get really, really happy. Some people get really, really sad. Right? These super high peaks and these super low troughs. Other people show much less variability. Right? They may be happy for the same amount of time, the same number of times, but not the same height of happiness, not the same depth of sadness, not the same height of anger, perhaps. So there's that difference in intensity. And there's some interesting things related to that in psychological disorders. Right? Borderline personality disorder is one interesting one that where it seems this kind of emotional numbing over time gives way to high intensity experience of emotion and then back to numbing. Right? So they go from feel nothing to anger, and then back to nothing, and then maybe super happy, I love you, you're the best, and then it could swing to anger again, but then may go back to that numbness. So this kind of dysregulation with heightened intensity of the highs and the lows associated with borderline personality disorder. And again, that's not bipolar disorder. People often conflate those two different things. PTSD, I know a lot of folks around here are familiar with that, is often associated with a restricted range of affect. So when we talk about a restricted range of affect, we're talking about not much intensity, right? So not going to feel a lot of different emotions. When they do, they don't never get real high or real low, with the exception of maybe anger. But otherwise, difficulty feeling really happy. There's something, people are home and they're safe from wars. Really great things happen, like, okay, for some reason. And we can go on in another class possibly about why that is, but not able to feel that intense joy because the range of affect intensity and the different types of emotions has become restricted. Another area of research in terms of expressiveness of emotions, so people differ in the way that in the way and the degree to which they express their emotions. Some interesting findings here related to gender. In general, and again, there are always exceptions, but in general, women tend to be more expressive of their emotions, and also better readers. They're better at understanding emotional expression than men. There are exceptions, but that's one of those gender things that tends to, on average, be true. There's some benefits of expressing your feelings. Right? People higher in expressed emotion tend to have happier relationships and better psychological health. So the idea of holding in your grudges, bad for you. Saying those things is good for you. But also, and again, some people get carried away and think, oh well, every time I'm mad I got to tell somebody. Yeah, but also tell them when you're happy. Tell them when you're grateful. It's not just expressing negative emotions that's associated with positive relationships. It's expressing the full range of emotions. So telling people that you love them and you're grateful for them, that's important and it's good for you. Going back to psychological disorders for a minute, expressed emotion is a different thing in terms of schizophrenia research. Here, expressed emotion is associated with relapse. Relapse being people come in and they're psychotic, they're actively having hallucinations and delusions. They go in the hospital, they get medicated. and schizophrenia is not gone, but the active phase symptoms are now under control. And they go home, and then if they go home to a family high in emotional expression, they tend to relapse, which means often a reemergence of those positive symptoms of their psychosis, delusions, hallucinations, all that stuff. So does this mean they go home and people tell them, I love you? No. In this research, expressed emotion has a very kind of unique meaning. Right? And so it doesn't just mean expressing your feelings. It's limited really to the expression of negative emotions in that area of research. Other areas of research, all emotions. This one is just about the negative ones. Not much research for people with schizophrenia about if they go to a family that's high in positive expressed emotion. It's really about those critical, angry, negative. Why aren't you doing this stuff? You know, people often, families complaining about the negative symptoms, or people with schizophrenia having problems with motivation, getting going. They get yelled at for that stuff. More likely to send them back to into their psychosis. Okay, talking about trait theory related to optimism and pessimism. We don't have a typical way of looking at upcoming challenges, right? Remembering back to attributional style, about how you explain when bad things or good things happen. You know, when we look at outcomes, we talk about the attributions. After it happened, here's why it happened. But we also, before something happens, there's this precursor, right? Before you're to face something, to what degree do you expect a good or successful outcome versus a negative outcome? It seems that people have a way of doing that is characteristic and fairly stable. Such that it's not, oh well, sometimes I expect good things, sometimes bad things. I don't know, it just depends on the situation. Well, it does depend on the situation some, but there's enough of a stability there that across situations, across time, some people tend to expect more positives, and some people tend to expect more negatives, such that we have this idea of dispositional optimism, that it seems to be trait-like. Especially in things related to it, optimism appears to be a protective buffer against adversity. People high in optimism show better adjustment after difficult situations. So things like surgery, taking care of a sick loved one, going to school for the first time. This is probably because optimistic people make greater use of active coping strategies, right? So they're going to, I think this is going to go well. I want to make sure it goes well by doing this, this, and this. Whereas people who are pessimistic, oh, this is not going to go well, they tend to be more avoidant and then don't do things to make it go well, because, well, it's not going to go well anyway. Why should I waste my time, getting ready? Optimism, pessimism, also related to health, another trait related to health. So it turns out that optimism is not just good for psychological health. Optimists tend to live longer, healthier lives. Right? So they live longer, and while they're alive, they tend to have less illness. Okay? This might be due in part because of an association with the experience of negative emotions, right? Maybe due to association with social networking, right? Where optimists tend to have larger social networks, richer social networks. And it may also be related to the impact of optimism on health-related behaviors, right? So again, here's this weird spot. It'll probably be fine, but I better go to the doctor to make sure. Versus pessimist, oh, here's a spot. I'm going to die. I could go to the doctor, but then the doctor would probably find something else wrong, and that would be even worse. So I'm not going to go, right? So, okay, that's all I want to talk about, optimism and pessimism. Just wrapping up, just want to say, remember, this is just, what we've talked about here is just a drop in the bucket regarding research relevant to trait theories. One thing I hope you've noticed is that the relationship between one trait and one behavior is rarely simple, right? Because in addition to situational variables that are at play, and then other traits influencing that behavior, the trait you may be looking at usually has subcomponents, right? Like we talked about that type A. It's not just, oh, type A, yeah. No, there's different pieces to type A. So these subcomponents of traits that an individual might be different on than some other individual, right? So talk about even things like, look at the big five. conscientiousness, somebody who's high in conscientiousness. So they're very neat, always on time, very ethical, all these things. And you may know somebody who think, well, geez, this person, they're always on time. They hate being late. Man, they are a mess. And that's because there are these different subcomponents of conscientiousness where you could be high in one piece of conscientiousness, but low in another. And again, when something forms a trait, it's because across all people, there tends to be some stability where, oh, if you're high in one subcomponent, you tend to be high in another. Just because there tends to be doesn't mean there aren't exceptions. And that certainly happens with traits at that kind of sub-level. There are often these individual exceptions where there is some diversity within that trait for a person. That's all for now. Take care.